Bible reading today is from Ecclesiastes 1, verses 12 to 18. And it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavenly burden God has laid on man. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than any who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this, too, is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief.
Okay. So, I don't know what to say about today's sermon. So when I've got Bible Day Camp as a distraction, it's always tough to kind of have that going and be preparing for this. And so this is, I've pulled this together, I think. I hope this works. Now, you might think that if I've been busy, then the sermon is short. No, it's actually the other way. It usually starts long, and the more I work on it, the shorter it gets. And so that's part of the challenge we've got here. But anyway, we'll try and we'll see what there is to be said. The other challenge is we're starting a sermon series, which is a really bad idea, to start something new when you don't have time to really sketch it all out and get it going. But something came together quite clearly here in chapter 1 that I want to share, the text that Naphtali read for us this morning. So let's get into that. On September 27th of 1928, Agnes Gonsha Boyashu, who was 18 years old at the time, left her home in Albania to join the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Ireland. She was following her dream. She wanted to become a Catholic nun, and so she began that, but she wanted more than just that. She was following her dream, but as she worked and served in the convent in Ireland, her dream grew. And eventually she came to this vision 20 years later that she would establish the Indian Missionary Society, the Indian Missionary Sisters of Charity, and serve the poorest of the poor in India. So she came to the leader of her order with that request, and by 1948, things had worked out. She had heard herself from God that she should be doing this. And so she received approval and traveled to Calcutta to begin the ministry. She obeyed the voice of Jesus and later records in her diaries that when she arrived in Calcutta, suddenly, mysteriously, painfully, once she arrived, the voice suddenly went silent. For the next 40 years, Agnes experienced a profound sense of loss and abandonment that shook the very foundations of her faith. To everyone else, the work of the missionary society flourished. It looked like it was a huge success. In fact, after a short time, it received international notoriety. Agnes herself became iconic, an inspirational figure, probably better known to you as Mother Teresa. But internally, Agnes struggled with feelings of loneliness and desolation. In 1959, she wrote a pained confession to one of her sponsors. Then she wrote that she was just overwhelmed with feelings of abandonment and unwantedness and being unloved by God. How painful is this unknown pain, she wrote. It pains without ceasing. I have no faith. I dare not utter the words and the thoughts that crowd my heart and make me suffer untold agony. So many unanswered questions live within me. I'm afraid to uncover them, for they are blasphemous. If there be God, please forgive me. Her letters and her private diaries were published later in 2006 against her expressed wishes, which I've always struggled with. And they're filled with accounts of anguished grief and doubts. She felt like an imposter without any foundation. At times, she even struggled to pray. But in time, she came to view this darkness differently. Her feelings of abandonment became what she describes as a mystical union with Christ. After all, Jesus was separated from God, the Father, as well. In 1961, she wrote, "I am not alone. I have his darkness. I experience his pain. I have terrible longing for God, to love and to not be loved. And I know that I share this with Jesus." So near the end of her life, the leaders of the Catholic Church began lobbying for Mother Teresa to be recognized as a saint, as you probably recall, before she died. And of course, she rejected the idea at first, but in her journal she records, "If I ever become a saint, I shall truly be one of darkness." Many people are startled when they hear this about Mother Teresa, the depth of the depression that she struggled with. They're just struck by this. Surely we anticipate seasons of spiritual dryness in our own lives. We're no doubt going to find trials that last weeks and maybe even months, but Mother Teresa's experience of spiritual emptiness and darkness lasted for more than 40 years. It's hard for many Christians to reconcile both the depth and the duration of Mother Teresa's dark experience of God-forsakenness. It's hard to reconcile that with the picture, the image that we have of this noble laureate who was also a spiritual hero to so many. We expect religious belief to be a source of joy and a source of hope, not a location of distress and pain. We expect faith to reduce pain, does it not? It doesn't cause it. But maybe this seeming paradox that we're looking at this morning comes from an overly simplistic model of faith. A model that fails to understand how negativity relates to faith and actually may be a sign of a mature and growing faith. The book of Ecclesiastes, then, helps to introduce some thoughts in this way. It speaks to this paradox. It's written by King David's son, Solomon, who, if you recall, was the wisest man who lived. And if you want to read more about that story, you read 1 Kings chapter 4. It appears that he wrote this book, Ecclesiastes, near the end of his life, after spending most of it seeking to answer the question, what's the meaning of life? What's the point? What's the point of existence? Why are we here? He starts the book in chapter 1 with this: "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." That's where he starts. What do people gain from all the labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and go, the teacher says, but the earth remains the same. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun hurries to its place of rising once more. The wind blows to the south, the wind blows to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning its course. All streams flow to the sea, but the sea is never full. And yet somehow the water returns from where it came. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 2 to 8. That comes before what Naphtali read for us this morning. Solomon begins here with a shocking statement. Meaning of life, there is no meaning, is what he says. But that's obviously not all there is to say about the matter, because there are 12 chapters in this book. This summer, we're going on a strange journey through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we are going to, if we're going to understand this book, there's a couple of tools that I would like for us to pick up for use along the way. Richard Beck, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Abilene, has written a book Here it is. The authenticity of faith, which I found very helpful. If you'd like to borrow, I'd be happy to loan it to you. But in this book, he describes the experience of religious faith and the people that have spoken in this field. He helps us by directing us to the idea that there might be more than one way of experiencing faith. I have to confess that over my life, I have felt kind of out of place in a traditional conservative Christian community. As a kid, I would hear people talk about faith and doubt as opposites on a spectrum, that faith was all the way this way and doubt was this way, and we kind of want to go this way. So we're always heading in this direction, and we're talking about apologetics, and that was considered basically shoring up the faith position because you're going to have so many people pushing you in the doubt position. That didn't jive with my experience. Now, I loved Jesus. I wanted to be a follower of Jesus, and I found faith in God wasn't always rainbows and butterflies. Certainty did not increase the confidence of my convictions. And praise God, I grew up in a church where the grown-ups, at least for the most part, were not afraid of tough questions. As a teen, my Sunday school teachers were not perturbed by tough questions. They did not turn away a cynic. Instead, they demonstrated a calm confidence in Jesus. They weren't afraid of the dark. Richard warns against a simplistic, bipolar model of faith and complaint here, that equates faith and certainty, which he calls low complaint or low levels of doubt, with unfaith and high complaint, high levels of doubt. Now, don't get me wrong. I grew up singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know," but I needed a more wholesome reading of the Bible. There were other things that the Bible told me so that weren't so pretty, and I had trouble figuring out what to do with those things. Now, instead, through his research, Richard develops a two-dimensional model that I find very helpful in describing religious faith experience. In addition to confidence going this way, high complaint as in high doubt, and low complaint as in low doubt, there's also this vertical dimension to the picture that talks about spiritual fellowship, what he calls communion with God, God closeness, and God nearness. And as you can see, it divides the panel up into 4 quadrants that I think you'll find most of us can find ourselves in at some given point in time. You've got people who are summer faith experience people. They are summer Christians, what Richard calls them. And they're people that experience high communion with God and low complaint, low levels of doubt. They have these experiences of worship that just fill them and enthrall them, and they find them to be tremendously valuable, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I have visited this place before. I've seen it. But there are people that live in the winter quarter of the faith experience, people who have doubt experience. They feel that doubt, and they want to explore that. And yet they still feel the closeness of God, even in the midst of difficulty. There is this closeness that they experience. Now, on the bottom side, I find it very interesting. If you are on the low communion, high complaint, so don't really feel closeness of God, have lots of doubts, he calls that the religious critic. Lots of questions, but not a lot of desire for answers, not a lot of desire for a fellowship with God. So there is a professional critic out there, a person that just always wants to ask the tough question and always wants to kind of shake people up and shake their confidence in the convictions that they hold. But when it comes right down to it, they're not actually looking to be all that close to God. Now, the only corner that's perhaps more dangerous than that is the disengaged believer with low complaint, low sense of doubt, but low sense of fellowship as well. Low doubt, no doubt, but no fellowship either. There's a God. Sure, there's a God. I'll check that box. But it doesn't matter one lick for how I run my life. It doesn't have any impact on me at all. This helpful framework is useful to keep in mind as we work our way through Ecclesiastes. But there is another tool that I'd like us to also have in hand before we continue. Walter Brueggemann talks about Scripture. He's an Old Testament scholar, and he talks about three different kinds of voices in the Bible. One is called orientation, a voice of orientation. Then there's also a voice of disorientation and a voice of reorientation. And what he means is, Walter could speak so well from the Old Testament texts that were dark and depressing because he recognized them as important, while other people would tend to skip them and move on to something else. So Walter Brueggemann wrote about Psalms of Lament. He wrote about these imprecatory psalms where we're wishing ill on our enemies, those sorts of things. He engaged in these deep and dark places because he recognized that sometimes the Bible is calling us to order, like in Psalm 1, where it just describes the heavens and the earth and the worship of God and the way things are meant to be. But there are other psalms, like Psalm 88, that just end with a voice of despair, a voice of disorientation, where things are not the way they're meant to be. This could be why nobody seems to want to do a sermon series in the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, here we go. Walter observes, and I want to read this quote at length because it's just so good. He observes, it's a curious fact that the church has, by and large, continued to sing songs of orientation in a world increasingly experienced as disordered or disoriented. It's my judgment that this action of the church is less an evangelical defense guided by faith, but is instead actually a much more frightened, numb denial and deception that does not want to acknowledge or experience the disorientation of life. Such a denial, Walter says, is an odd inclination for passionate Bible users, given the number of psalms and other texts that are of lament and protest and complaint about an incoherence that's experienced in the world. I believe that serious religious use of lament psalms has been minimal because we have believed that faith does not mean to acknowledge or embrace negativity. I find that really engaging. This is why texts like what Naphtali read for us this morning are so important. They treat doubt and disorientation fairly. They hear them out. They want to hear what they have to say. And there is still a gospel word to be heard, even in texts that talk about despairing things. Sometimes you just need to wait in the dark for Jesus to come along. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon describes himself as the teacher and turns first to the pursuit of wisdom. And that's the section that we read this morning. So if you've got a Bible and you aren't already there, turn to chapter 1. He's looking for an answer to the question of the meaning of life. And what the teacher says is he runs into a brick wall. What he runs into is captured by poetic verse of a conventional wisdom that he has received. So what you read in verse 15 there is not, it's something that's written in a book of poetry or somewhere else. It's conventional wisdom. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted, is what the teacher says, which is to say, when seeking wisdom, there's always going to be more. There's always going to be something else to learn. You're never going to get to the bottom of that well. There's always more to learn. I have known classmates in my seminary classes who were losing themselves to the study of the Bible and in turn losing their faith. It sounds crazy. Some would study Greek or Hebrew and then continue into Attic Greek or Aramaic or Syriac and continue into increasingly obscure biblical languages with smaller and smaller communities of nerds that specialize there. There's nothing wrong with extensive study, so don't get me wrong, but if you're not careful, you will lose your faith along the way. I remember that when I started my master's degree at McMaster, my mom had said regarding graduate study, well, fine, you can do that, just don't go crazy. So I hope, Mom, I haven't gone crazy. In a much more everyday sort of way, when we read the Bible, anyone can lose the forest for the trees. Like, we all do this without getting doctorate degrees. We can study the Sermon on the Mount. We can maybe explore the Greek a bit, or we can look at other texts in the New Testament that talk about the same thing and never encounter the heart of Jesus. That's part of what we're doing on Wednesday nights this summer. We're spending one Wednesday night being the hands and feet of Jesus. So this coming Wednesday, rather than the Bible study here at the building, we are encouraging you, find someone to visit. Find somewhere to go that you could maybe interact or engage with some people, and then come back the next week and we'll talk a little bit about that in light of Scripture. That's something that we're trying to do. Study's not bad, but the teacher tells us in verse 18 that the search for wisdom leads to sorrow. The search for wisdom leads to frustration. Now, this world is not what it's meant to be. It's being made new. And one day it will be made new when Jesus returns. But today, our world still lives in rebellion to God. There's never an end to study. If study is focused on the horizontal axis here, I lost my spot. There it is. If our study is focused on the horizontal axis here, seeking certainty, reducing doubt without attending to the relational vertical dimension here, we can disappear into a paralysis by analysis. We will know our Bibles inside and out, but we will lose the one to whom the Bible points. That's why it's sometimes helpful to dwell in the Word, something that we do here in worship from time to time. Dwelling in the Word, focusing on a Bible text repeatedly instead of moving on to another text. Sitting with a text, perhaps reading the words, and then just sitting quietly and seeing what we notice. Or taking a text and memorizing it, or sitting with it for a while. We might take a verse or two from the Bible and practice writing it out so that those words just become more and more familiar, distracting our mind with the task of writing, but allowing that verse to just kind of sit in our minds. That's a spiritual practice that's often helpful. Whether in confidence or in doubt, we need an encounter with God that reminds us and regrounds us in God's unconditional love for us. In addition to Bible study and prayer, there are some other spiritual practices that are helpful. And we've talked about practices of silence, solitude, and stillness, those being helpful. One is a practice called beholding the beloved. And it's as simple as this. You find a space where you're not distracted by your own body and you just get comfortable. Leave your feet flat on the ground. And just through silence, you prepare yourself to use your spiritual imagination and imagine Jesus sitting beside you. Now, you don't need to worry about the appearance of the picture. In fact, if you want, you can turn the chairs behind you. You don't need to look at it. But imagine yourself being seen by the beloved. Imagine yourself in the presence of Jesus. What might Jesus have to say to you this morning? What do you want to say to Jesus? Practices like this help us to appreciate and embrace this idea that Jesus is truly in love with us. That God really loves you, and there's no denying it. And that we have spiritual benefit for our souls that comes from just spending time with Jesus. Not learning anything or studying anything, but just spending time with Jesus. This kind of deliberate presence is exactly the kind of communion that Richard Beck is talking about in the vertical dimension here of the picture. This is the kind of fellowship with God. It speaks to our souls. It nourishes our souls. In 2002, when Julie's mom died, she was the same age as I am now. At the time, what I didn't find helpful was advice like, oh, she's in a better place. or she's reunited with her parents, or I would be told that she's reunited with a sibling that I happen to know she wasn't, frankly, that close to. I was in a pretty dark place at the time. I felt exposed and I felt vulnerable. The day after we turned off the life support and we watched her die, we left the ICU building at the University of Ottawa Hospital, walked across an outdoor garden, and I felt unsafe. I had just come to realize that there was nothing holding the sky up, nothing stopping it from just dropping out of the heavens and taking you out when you least expected it. In the days that followed, I had well-meaning people that were trying to get me to cry about this loss, like that would work like excising a wound so that it could start to heal again. And I found the most helpful thing at that time was reading the book of Ecclesiastes. I read it on repeat every 2 days for weeks. One day I'd read chapters 1 through 8. The next day I would read chapters 9 through 12, all in one sitting. Again and again and again, I would keep reading that book. And you know what I learned? Nothing. Nothing. I still didn't understand why my mother-in-law was gone, and I still don't. I'm still convinced it wasn't fair that she would never meet the twins. But the teacher showed me that in that very dark place, Jesus was there. Jesus met me in the dark in the book of Ecclesiastes. He was very familiar with these questions. Jesus familiar with sorrow. Jesus was familiar with unfairness. And Jesus sat there with me and showed me that I had a place to stand.